The look of Cincinnati has changed a great deal in the 200 years since her founding, from frontier outpost to the last bastion of civilization on the front door of the Wild West, to sleepy industrial town that slipped quietly into the shadow of faster-growing Midwestern neighbors, to a city which is widely regarded as one of the most livable in the country from any perspective. Civic, business, cultural, and quality of life. I'm Schottelkotte. What you're about to see is not a document of the year-by-year evolution of a city, but rather a look at some of the people and institutions that contributed to the great, the near-great, and not-so-great moments in Cincinnati history. Cincinnati's memorable moments have been many, and not a few of them have unfolded before the city's personal symbol, the Tyler-Davidson Fountain. Its own story is special. The block of 5th Street, called Fountain Square, was a butcher's marketplace until 1870. That's when businessman Henry Probasco offered to donate a huge fountain to honor his brother-in-law and business partner Tyler Davidson if the city would find an appropriate place for it and promised to maintain it forever. The city agreed and chose the 5th Street Marketplace as the site. But the butchers resisted, citing a city ordinance of 1827, which proclaimed the area a permanent marketplace. The Ohio Supreme Court eventually ruled against the butchers, and City Council voted to tear down the market. Within an hour of the vote, an armed posse of sheriff's deputies and volunteers had demolished it as the helpless butchers looked on. That ended the argument. The Tyler-Davidson Fountain was dedicated on October the 6th, 1871. The only trace of that 1827 ordinance which remains today is the flower stand on the southwest corner of Fountain Square, which is open just one day a year so the mayor can buy a carnation and ease the civic conscience by keeping alive the letter of that old ordinance. It wasn't far from Fountain Square, where Cincinnatians took to the streets to celebrate the end of the Civil War. Many were still carrying on in the wee hours of the morning of April 16, 1865, when an 18-year-old itinerant telegraph operator ran from the nearby Western Union office shouting that President Lincoln had been assassinated. The crowd fell silent and the revelry ended. Word quickly spread to Pike's Opera House, where a celebrated actor was alone rehearsing. Junius Brutus Booth, Jr. fainted when told his brother had killed the president. The young telegraph operator left town not long after that and ended up in New Jersey, where he invented the light bulb. He was Thomas Edison. Cincinnati has been home to many firsts over the years, some great, some not so great. In 1836, William Holmes McGuffey first published his Eclectic Readers and started a publishing boom in Cincinnati. By the end of the century, only the Bible had been read by more Americans than McGuffey's readers. In the 1850s, Cincinnati became the first city with a paid fire department. In earlier days, volunteers would brawl for the right to put out fires and collect the insurance money. Often, buildings burned to the ground while the volunteers fought. On Mount Adams, in the 1860s, Cleveland Abbey founded the first weather bureau. The Army Signal Corps was so impressed, it lured Abbey away to expand his bureau into the United States Weather Service. In the 1870s, Cincinnati established the May Festival, now the oldest such music event in the country. America's first Jewish hospital and the first Reformed Jewish Theological College, Hebrew Union, are in Cincinnati, where Reformed Judaism was born. In 1880, Cincinnati became the only U.S. city to build its own railroad, the Cincinnati Southern, which it still owns and profits from. In the 1920s, Cincinnati became the first city to construct a subway and never use it, except to store civil defense rations and to house a water main. The city decided not to finish the subway when people fell in love with the automobile and stopped using public transportation. In the 1950s, the University of Cincinnati's Dr. Albert Sabin developed the first oral polio vaccine. Not long after Cincinnati was founded, steamboats and the city's favorable location in the emerging Northwest Territory enabled it to become a distribution hub for people and products traveling north and south. By the 1870s, Cincinnati had become the fifth largest city in the country. But when railroads displaced steamboats as the favored means of transportation, Cincinnati's rapid growth ended. The winter of 1917-1918 virtually wiped out what was left of the dying steamboat industry. That year, the Ohio River froze so solidly that everything shore to shore was locked in ice. When the ice thawed, huge floes surged downriver, tearing apart and sinking scores of riverboats and wharves. Few packets continued to operate after that devastating winter. Steam tows and barges became the preferred method of Ohio River transportation. Even that method fell useless during the summer months when the river would drop to an average depth of 3 feet. So in the mid-1920s, the Army Corps of Engineers built a series of locks and dams that stabilized the river's depth at a minimum of 12 feet and allowed shipping year-round. On October the 22nd, 1929, President Herbert Hoover arrived in Cincinnati aboard a steamboat to speak at ceremonies marking completion of the dams and locks. He was accompanied by his friend Nicholas Longworth of Cincinnati, the Speaker of the House. President Hoover dedicated the commemorative obelisk which stands in Eden Park. His appearance in Cincinnati marked the last time the president would smile in public for some time to come. Exactly 1 week later, the stock market collapsed and plunged the country into the Great Depression. In Cincinnati, Mayor Russell Wilson might have been smiling on the outside, but crying on the inside, as he used worthless stock certificates to paper the walls of his City Hall office. But his city wasn't as hard hit by the Depression as the rest of the country, thanks in part to several building projects designed and funded before the Wall Street collapse. 2 major undertakings alone kept thousands of people working. One was the Carew Tower, begun in 1929 and finished a year later. The other was construction of Union Terminal, truly a great moment in Cincinnati history. In 1927, the railroads agreed to share one station to be built on the site of Lincoln Park. It was the first time in a major American city that all competing rail companies would occupy one terminal. Union Terminal would replace 2 frequently flooded depots in the Bottoms area and 3 others downtown. To begin, it was necessary to drain and fill in a large lake in Lincoln Park. Workers brought in steam shovels to strip away Bald Knob to the west to get the needed dirt. That task alone took 1 year. Construction of the terminal itself began in 1929. 45,000 tons of steel and 8 million bricks were used to build it at a cost of $41 million. In 1931, Mayor Wilson and officials of the railroads laid the cornerstone, which isn't on a corner at all. The terminal was dedicated 16 months later, on March 31st, 1933. Visitors marveled at the number of shops, restaurants, the movie theater, and the huge mosaics depicting Cincinnati history and Cincinnati industries. The mosaics were the work of a black artist, Winold Rice. But the great terminal was to suffer an early death. Less than 40 years later, on October 28, 1972, a Baltimore and Ohio train bound for Washington, D.C., became the last regularly scheduled passenger train to leave Union Terminal. A not-so-great moment for the city occurred the day the Mount Adams Incline closed in 1948. The Cincinnati Transit Company said it needed repairs. It never reopened. Mount Adams was the last of the 5 inclines built at the end of the 19th century to move goods and people up and down the steep hills surrounding the downtown basin. But new streets and automobiles made them obsolete. The Mount Auburn, Fairview, and Bellevue inclines were out of business by 1926. The one in Price Hill lasted until 1943. At one time, there had been 2 in Price Hill, one for freight, the other for people. They were safe conveyances, usually. But one day in 1906, the cable on the freight side snapped. The platform lurched toward an inevitable crash at the bottom of the hill, with 2 young men, their horses and wagons aboard. The youths averted almost certain death by diving into their cargoes to soften the impact. One crawled unscathed from his load of sand. The other, Joe Strassel of Sedamsville, became an instant celebrity when he crawled out from his load of manure. A saloon operator gave Joe use of his bathtub and a derby hat. Another gave Joe some clean trousers, and a coachman from the nearby Lackman Brewery hitched up his team and took Joe triumphantly home. Chances are the coach used to transport young Strassel was made in Cincinnati. At the turn of the century, more than half the coaches and carriages used in the United States were built in the Queen City. Henry Ford knew that. In 1901, he came to Cincinnati to try to persuade some of the carriage manufacturers to finance and build his automobile engines. The car bodies could be produced in converted carriage plants. Local bankers told Ford they had little faith in his horseless carriages, so Ford took his ideas back to Detroit. The rest, as they say, is history. Cincinnati may have missed its chance to become the automotive capital of the world, but it did contribute to the emerging aviation industry. Lunken was one of the first municipal airports in the world. 2 airplanes were manufactured there. The Flamingo, fabricated by the Metal Aircraft Corporation, was one of the first all-metal monoplanes made in America. Down Wilmer Avenue, in a small hangar, Aeronca planes were produced. American Airlines was formed in Cincinnati and based at Lunken. And Charles Lindbergh flew into Lunken to refuel on his way to New York to begin his historic transatlantic flight. Cincinnati has been home to 2 noted figures in the space program. Neil Armstrong, the first man to walk on the moon, taught aerospace engineering at the University of Cincinnati after leaving NASA. Armstrong also became active in Cincinnati business circles. Nancy Wenger, Miss Cincinnati of 1960 as Nancy Mason, became one of the 10 finalists in the Teacher in Space project. She trained with 9 other teachers and the crew of the Space Shuttle Challenger. After the Challenger disaster in 1986, she continued to work for NASA and was assigned to the team sent to New Zealand to study and photograph Halley's Comet. Cincinnati's businesses have experienced many great moments, some by plan, some by pure accident. Slaughtered meat spoiled quickly in the early days, so the market was generally local, until 1810. That's when Cincinnatian Richard Fosdick invented a rock-salt method of curing pork so it could be stored for long periods of time without spoiling. Fosdick made meatpacking a big business in his hometown, Soon Cincinnati was supplying all the salt pork used by the British Navy. So many pigs were marched into Cincinnati for slaughter that the town became known as Porkopolis. Procter & Gamble got its start by buying animal fat from the slaughterhouses and turning it into soap and candles. Over the years, P&G has developed many profitable products, but its most famous and most successful one came about as a result of an accident. It occurred shortly after the company developed a formula for a white soap to compete with popular European brands. The ingredients of the soap were mixed in a giant machine called a crutcher. One day, the man in charge forgot to turn off the machine when he went to lunch. The ingredients were unintentionally mixed with air, like whipped cream. Shortly after that batch of soap was shipped, the company began receiving large orders for more of the soap that floats. Bewildered P&G officials had to trace down what happened, then figure out a way to repeat the accident consistently. They did. And that combination of a pure white soap with tiny bubbles of air made Ivory the best-selling soap in America for more than a century. At the turn of the century, more than 24 breweries operated in Cincinnati, where beer consumption averaged 40 gallons a year per person. 95% of that beer was made in town. But Prohibition wiped out most of the breweries. One that survived, Schottelkotte, made near beer and soft drinks until Prohibition was repealed. Schottelkotte has now merged with Shanley, the only brewery left to carry on Cincinnati's proud brewing tradition. By 1900, Barney Kroger had already opened several stores. He succeeded by living his motto, do what your competitor neglects to do. Kroger astounded customers by putting price tags on merchandise and neatly arranging wares on shelves. Cincinnati Milling Machine, now Millicron, for years dominated the world machine tool market. Rookwood Pottery, at the turn of the century, had gained an international reputation for its exquisite products. No piece was ever duplicated. Decorators for the famous pottery were hired from the Cincinnati Art Academy. Each had a specialty, like portraits, landscapes, or flowers. Rookwood won many international prizes. The pottery, founded by Maria Longworth Storer in 1880, ceased operations in the 1960s. One of the truly great moments of the last century came in 1877. Music Hall opened. It was designed not only for concerts, but industrial exhibitions, literary readings, social, political, and sporting events as well. The Democratic Convention of 1880 was held at Music Hall, the last presidential nominating convention of a major party held in Cincinnati. In 1914, former President Theodore Roosevelt pushed his progressive principles to the Cincinnati Businessmen's Club, gathered at Music Hall to celebrate the club's 25th anniversary. But as it should be, the hall is best known for the music performed in its auditorium and some of the conductors who directed it, like Eugene Goosens, Leopold Stokowski, and Max Rudolph. In 1920, summer opera was established at the Cincinnati Zoo. Many world-renowned artists began their careers singing duets with trumpeting elephants and roaring lions. The opera, now at Music Hall, is the nation's second oldest.
Did you ever have that before?
Yes, I did.
Well, you got it again.
Not long after the opera was founded, Cincinnati's first radio station, WLW, went on the air. Powell Crosley built the station so people would have something to listen to on the radios he was manufacturing. WLW achieved international fame in 1934 when President Roosevelt flipped the switch in the White House to make WLW at 500,000 watts the world's most powerful radio station. As soon as he moved the switch, FDR began reading a speech into the WLW microphone on his desk, but no one heard much of it. Someone forgot to tell the president that the giant tubes in the new transmitter needed several minutes to warm up. By the time they did, Mr. Roosevelt had almost finished his prepared remarks. Later, as more stations went on the air, the government ordered WLW to reduce its power to the current 50,000 watts. Over the years, WLW gave birth to several famous careers and to a form of broadcasting now more popular than ever.
If I thought I'd ever be as bitter and cynical toward marriage in life, I'd rather be dead, really, I would.
Soap operas.
Oh, hold me tight, Kurt. Hold me tight because I'm afraid.
99 and 44 100% pure enjoyment. Compliments of Ivory Soap, the most famous...
The Clooney sisters got their start on WLW. So did Fats Waller, the Mills Brothers, Rod Serling, and comedian Red Skelton. Television came to Cincinnati in 1947. Without a doubt, the most popular local TV personality ever was Ruth Lyons, a woman who did everything without a script and did it very well.
Mr. Nixon, Mr. Kennedy are debating. I think they're being entirely too adorable, both of them.
Yes, they are. This won't be a fighting debate. I don't think either has the opportunity to ask the other a direct question.
I don't like that kind of debate. I like them to stand right up to one another and say, do you think so? Why do you think so?
Chin to chin.
Chin to chin.
Music videos had their origin on Cincinnati television way back in the late 40s and early 50s. WCPO TV's Mort Waters created them, locally and on network television. They called it pantomime then, lip-syncing and emoting to popular songs, as lovely Dottie Mack was doing here on the Dumont Network.
I know I must surrender to your kiss of fire.
How many of these other programs and celebrities do you remember?
Everybody jump up high, everybody jump up high. Everybody clap your hands round and round the globe. Everybody. Barney Google had a wife 3 times his size. You notice that key's a little better for me tonight. I talked to the boys in the orchestra and they put it down a notch. Barney Google, here comes the pretty part.
If you do anything you wanted to him, you could punch him as hard as you could in the stomach and nothing mattered to Charlie. Moreover, when you got hit on the shin and they raised a big mouse on his leg.
11 o'clock, and time for the El Schottelkotte News, brought to you tonight and every night with the H&S Pope Company, Cincinnati's quality department stores downtown and the Kenwood Plaza.
El Schottelkotte here. Stand by for the news.
Oh, gee whiz. Al, can we have a rewrite on page 2?
Richard Sanders, the actor who played Les Nessman on WKRP in Cincinnati, wasn't a local product, but Cincinnati has produced its share of show business celebrities. The first was a cross-eyed waiter who was working at the Atlantic Gardens on Vine Street when he saw his first Mack Sennett movie short. His name was Ben Turpin. Soon after, Turpin left to audition for Sennett and became a star. He insured his crossed eyes with Lloyd's of London for $1 million in case they became uncrossed and ruined his trademark. Hollywood's first sex symbol was from Cincinnati. Her name was Theda Bara, an anagram for Arab Death. Actually, she was Theodosia Goodman, daughter of a Jewish tailor who lived in Avondale. When Doris Day grew up in Price Hill, she was Doris Kappelhoff. She sang on WLW. So did Andy Williams, who lived in Cheviot. He got his break in Hollywood when his voice was substituted for that of a star who couldn't sing, Lauren Bacall. Roy Rogers, real name Leonard Sly, was born just about where second base is located at Riverfront Stadium. Tyrone Power grew up in Walnut Hills and went to Purcell High School. After achieving fame and fortune in Hollywood, he wanted to do something nice for his alma mater. He offered to build a new gymnasium at Purcell, but the religious order that ran the school turned him down because Power was divorced. Cincinnati was also home to Miss America of 1944, Venus Ramey. In the pageant, she wore the banner of Washington, D.C. because she was living there at the time. In Cincinnati, she became active in community affairs in the Over the Rhine and ran for Cincinnati City Council in 1979. In that contest, she lost. Three residents of the Queen City made it to the White House. The first was William Henry Harrison, who was Hamilton County Clerk of Courts when elected president in 1840. At age 68, he was the oldest man elected to a first term until Ronald Reagan came along. Harrison also gave the longest inaugural address in history, more than 2 hours, delivered in a freezing rain without a topcoat. He caught pneumonia and died 1 month later. The next Cincinnati president was Rutherford B. Hayes. He was so popular in Cincinnati that he won election to Congress without being around to campaign. He was away fighting in the Civil War. Hayes won the disputed presidential election of 1876. His opponent, New York Governor Samuel Tilden, won the popular balloting, but there were a number of disputed electoral college votes. Tilden needed just one of them to become the first Democrat elected president after the Civil War. But all the disputed electoral votes went to Hayes, who found out he would be president just 2 days before his inauguration in 1877. The third president to get his political start in Cincinnati was a native son, William Howard Taft. He certainly was the biggest president, at more than 6 feet tall and weighing 350 pounds. Taft was Theodore Roosevelt's Secretary of War and a close friend of the president. Several times Taft hinted to Roosevelt that he'd like an appointment to the Supreme Court, but Taft's wife, Helen, urged President Roosevelt to support her husband for the presidency if Roosevelt decided not to run again. Roosevelt listened to Mrs. Taft and successfully supported her husband for the Republican nomination in 1908. Taft won an easy victory. As president, he oversaw completion of the Panama Canal. He had supervised the beginning of the project for President Roosevelt a few years earlier. During Taft's term, he and Roosevelt fell out over several issues. In 1912, Roosevelt bolted the Republican Party to run against Taft on the Bull Moose ticket. Both men lost to Democrat Woodrow Wilson. In 1921, Taft got his ultimate wish. He was appointed Chief Justice of the Supreme Court by President Warren Harding. When sworn in, Taft became the only man to have held the country's 2 highest offices. As Chief Justice, Taft was a featured speaker at the dedication of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington. He died in 1930 and was the first president to be buried at Arlington National Cemetery. "20 years later, Cincinnatians thought they'd have a chance to put another Taft in the White House. He was Senator Robert A. Taft, son of the president.
I have decided to accept the invitation of Thomas E. Coleman and other leading Republicans of Wisconsin to enter the Wisconsin primary as a Republican candidate for President of the United States.
At the 1952 Republican nominating convention in Chicago, a bitter floor fight developed over delegates from Texas. Both Taft and General Dwight Eisenhower claimed 68 delegates from the Lone Star State. Ultimately, Eisenhower's delegates were seated, and he went on to win the nomination. Taft agreed to support Eisenhower only after the general agreed, in writing, to uphold traditional Republican principles as advanced by Taft, Mr. Republican. During a campaign swing through the Midwest, the two stopped in Cincinnati.
I feel proud that the citizens of Cincinnati have come out in such tremendous numbers and with such great enthusiasm, and I never have seen a crowd such as lined the streets of this city tonight, and equally proud to introduce to them the Republican candidate for president, Dwight D. Eisenhower.
Eisenhower beat Adlai Stevenson to become president. Senator Taft died a year later. Salmon P. Chase was another Cincinnatian who wanted to be president but didn't make it. He did become Abraham Lincoln's Secretary of the Treasury, and later Lincoln appointed him Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Chase holds two distinctions in the history of American money. Shortly after Congress authorized issuance of a national currency, Chase, as Treasury Secretary, had his picture placed on the first $1 bill, issued in 1862. Chase's picture was later replaced by that of George Washington. But the Bureau of Engraving honored Chief Justice Chase by putting his picture on the $10,000 bill, the largest denomination note ever circulated. The last was printed in 1969, but they're still legal tender if you can afford one. As Cincinnati has had its share of famous lawmakers, so too has it had its share of noted lawbreakers, including at times the citizenry itself. The courthouse riot of 1884 was set off when a man accused of murdering his employer was convicted of a lesser charge, manslaughter. Citizens complained it was another in a long line of trials in which the jury was allegedly fixed. An angry mob stormed the courthouse to find the defendant and lynch him. After 2 days of rioting, National Guard troops brought in a Gatling gun to restore order. When the firing stopped, more than 50 were dead, 300 injured, and the courthouse was in ruins in one of the bloodiest riots in American history. In 1967, summer riots hit Cincinnati's black neighborhoods. The riots were part of a pattern of eruptions that summer in black ghettos across the country. Shootings, rock and brick throwing, looting, and vandalism were compounded by arsons which burned away millions of dollars in property. The outbreaks did not subside until 1,000 National Guard troops were brought in. More than 300 arrests were made, mostly in Walnut Hills and Avondale. 2 years later, this crime made national headlines. Charles Manson, the cultist convicted of planning them, was born at Cincinnati General Hospital on November the 12th, 1934, the illegitimate son of a Cincinnati prostitute. Hospital records list him simply as No-Name Maddox. At one point, when he was an infant, Manson's mother sold him to a waitress in a bar for the price of a pitcher of beer. Authorities found out and made the waitress give him back. At least, that's the way Manson tells it. More recently, the city found itself the operating base for one of the most murderous fiends in U.S. history, maybe the worst. Hospital orderly Donald Harvey pleaded guilty in the deaths of more than 24 people, most of them at Hamilton County's Drake Hospital. But Harvey himself told authorities the accurate list of his victims could total at least 54. The irony of the Harvey case, had it not been for the relentless detective work of WCPO TV, the world might have known of only one alleged Harvey victim, and Harvey might even have won acquittal on that block. In the 1930s, Cincinnatian Anna Marie Hahn became the first woman to die in Ohio's electric chair. She was convicted of the poison murders of 5 elderly men. Mrs. Hahn had to be carried, kicking and screaming, into the room where the death sentence was carried out. Perhaps the most colorful criminal in the city's long history was the king of the bootleggers, George Remus. Remus had been a successful criminal defense attorney in Chicago, but gave up his practice when Prohibition arrived. He took up the hard liquor trade in Cincinnati. Remus said he liked Cincinnati's central location as a distribution center. His base of operations was his Death Valley farm off Queen City Avenue. Within 5 years, Remus piled up a fortune estimated at $5 million. In a touch of irony, he bought the Lackman Mansion on Hermosa Avenue in Price Hill. The Lackman family brewery had been shut down by Prohibition. Remus filled the mansion with rare books, fine art, and a $100,000 indoor swimming pool. He was known for his lavish parties. At one, he gave Pontiac sedans and $25,000 in jewelry to his guests. Revenue agents raided his Death Valley hideout in 1921. Remus went to jail 3 years later after the Supreme Court upheld his bootlegging conviction. Just before his release, Remus's wife Imogene filed for divorce. She had taken up with Franklin Dodge, the federal agent who had put Remus behind bars. On the day the divorce trial was to begin, Remus trailed Imogene to Eden Park and fatally shot her as she hugged him and pleaded for her life. Remus was acquitted of murder on grounds of temporary insanity. Betty Donovan, a former Cincinnati Post reporter, recalled that Remus showed her late husband, Charles Rentrop, also a Post reporter, how he planned to convince the jury he was insane.
He said, "Come on, kid, I'll show you what I'm going to do." Charlie being about 2 years younger than George Remus. And he put a small sliver of soap in his mouth, and when he got into the courtroom, he sat there looking glassy-eyed and began to foam at the mouth and fell down and had a fit.
Remus spent several months at Lima State Hospital and was released when doctors said his sanity had been restored. He spent the rest of his life in relative obscurity, never again crossing paths with the law. He died in 1952. Several not-so-great moments in Cincinnati history involved disasters, some natural, others man-made. On the night of December the 3rd, 1979, 11 young people died when trying to get into a concert by the rock group Who. The crowd had arrived early that night at Riverfront Coliseum to wait for the doors to open to take advantage of festival seating, as it was called. Simply put, those who got inside first got the best seats. On that night, the jam of waiting people grew faster than anyone anticipated. When officials reacted, they opened fewer doors than needed to handle the rush. 11 people literally were crushed to death. Festival seating was subsequently banned by law. Although the Beverly Hills fire happened outside the city, Cincinnatians suffered with the rest of the community over the loss of 166 lives when the Supper Club burned in May of 1977. It was unquestionably the worst mass tragedy ever in the greater Cincinnati area. Many a tornado has left death and destruction in its path since the first settlers arrived in 1788. One of the worst in terms of injuries and property damage hit on August the 9th, 1969. It erupted from a summer storm and cut across Cincinnati and its northern suburbs, damaging more than 1,000 buildings, killing 4, and injuring more than 200. 5 years later, on April 3rd, 1974, twisters leveled houses in Sailor Park, cut across South Road in Mack, through St. Bernard and Elmwood Place, and on up to Xenia, where the downtown was virtually wiped out and scores died. In Cincinnati, property damage was in the millions, and 5 perished. WCPO TV news cameras caught the tornado live as it moved destructively across western Hamilton County and gave a dramatic warning to those in its path of the terrible menace headed their way. The city's worst natural disaster was the 1937 flood. The Ohio River was out of its banks for 19 days. At its crest, the river covered 15% of the city. 8 died. Almost 100,000 greater Cincinnatians were homeless, and property damage exceeded $25 million. The river passed the 52-foot flood stage at 7 in the morning on January 18th. Things worsened as rain fell almost continuously for the rest of the week. By Friday, the Ohio had risen above 70 feet. By Saturday, 6 inches of snow had fallen. Water pumps at the East End station were in danger of being inundated. All bridges but the suspension had closed. Union Terminal was an island. Then came Black Sunday. In the Mill Creek Valley, near the Crosley radio plant on Arlington Street, rising backwaters upended a number of Standard Oil gasoline storage tanks, spreading their contents on the floodwaters. It wasn't long before a streetcar cable snapped and fell in a shower of sparks into the gasoline-covered water. Within minutes, the scene was an inferno. 32 buildings caught fire. Firefighters were laboring to bring the blaze under control when the East End pumping station finally gave out. Firemen disconnected their intake hoses from the hydrants, dropped them into the floodwaters, and kept on fighting until the fire was out. In the midst of the greatest flood on record, Cincinnatians were without water. They looked for long-abandoned springs. Norwood's wells made some water available. Tank trucks and railroad tank cars full of water were sent in from Cleveland and Indianapolis. Music Hall became a refugee center. So did the National Guard Armory and area churches. The rising Ohio next knocked out the West End Power Station. Electricity had to be imported from nearby cities and rationed. On Monday, January 25th, the river crested at 79.99 feet. Sightseers paid a quarter to ride to the top of the Crew Tower to view it. Onlookers at Coney Island saw roller coasters writhing above the waves like skeletons of ghostly sea serpents. Boats and boots were the order of the day, every day, until February 5th, when the Ohio River finally dropped back within its banks. Coney Island was the area's favorite park when it wasn't underwater. In the gay 90s, the park was called Ohio Grove and was billed as the Coney Island of the West. Steamboats made daily round trips from the public landing to the park. The most famous Coney Island steamer was the Island Queen. The 5-deck steamboat offered music, dancing, and refreshments during its lazy rides to the park and back. Many a first kiss was stolen on the top deck under the stars while Clyde Trask's orchestra played in the background. The Island Queen exploded and burned to the waterline on a visit to Pittsburgh in 1947. Almost from the beginning, roller coasters were the great attractions at Coney. The Wildcat, an early favorite, and the Shooting Star. Care for one more ride? Other popular features were the Ferris wheel, Lake Como, the Penny Arcade, the Lost River, Funhouse, Wild Mouse, and toward the end, the Sky Ride. And there was Coney's famous saltwater taffy. Sunlight, the world's largest recirculating swimming pool. And Moonlight Gardens, where many couples ended a long day at Coney with a slow dance, cheek to cheek, if they weren't out watching the fireworks. The colorful pyrotechnics on Labor Day in 1971 signaled closing of the amusement park. Kings Island opened the next year. But Sunlight Pool remains, now with water slides. And Riverbend Amphitheater has been built for summer concerts. So Coney continues as a vital entertainment facility, even if the Shooting Star is but a memory. Another great Cincinnati moment occurred the day the Graf Zeppelin landed safely in New Jersey at the end of her maiden voyage from Germany in 1929. The huge craft unloaded a passenger destined to become one of the more popular residents ever at the Cincinnati Zoo. Her name was Susie, and she was the only trained gorilla in America. Children would crowd around to watch Susie feed herself with a fork and spoon as trainer William Dressman looked on. The polite Susie would offer Dressman a bit of her lunch. He always declined. Susie died in 1947. Nowadays, rare white tigers are among the prized residents at the zoo. Trained elephants were the specialty of Cincinnatian John Robinson, who operated the oldest family-owned circus in America in the early 1900s. Bowling was a hobby of his precious pachyderms, although they weren't very good at it. In the late 1800s, Robinson wintered his animals in the basement of his downtown opera house. Later, after the building was torn down, he quartered them on his suburban Terrace Park estate. Every spring, Tilly the elephant plowed Robinson's garden for him as curious neighbors looked on. When Tilly died, she was pulled to her grave on the estate by another elephant in true circus tradition. Buffalo Bill's Wild West show was one of the great spectacles of its day. Real cowboys and Indians and real covered wagons paraded into Cincinnati 5 times between 1884 and 1901. On 4 of those occasions, the main attraction was a diminutive brunette who had begun her ascent to worldwide stardom in 1875 on a hill overlooking the Queen City. She was Phoebe Ann Moses, then a 15-year-old country girl from Darke County, Ohio. She had come to Cincinnati to live with her older sister, Lydia, whose husband was a Cincinnati businessman. Annie Moses left a year later. When she did, she took with her a new name, borrowed from a Cincinnati suburb, Oakley. Annie Oakley. Annie had learned to shoot with her late father's muzzle loader. She earned money for her family, bagging game birds with a single shot through the head, then sending them to Beavis House, a Cincinnati hotel. The restaurant there earned a reputation as the only place in town where fowl was served free of buckshot, a hazard to patrons' teeth. While in Cincinnati, Spunky Annie challenged the great marksman Frank Butler to a trap shooting contest up on Shooter's Hill in Clifton Heights. Annie beat the 25-year-old Butler 25 clay pigeons to 24. But the vanquished Butler was so taken by the youthful winner that he began courting her. They were married in Cincinnati in 1876. They joined Buffalo Bill's show in 1885 and stayed with it through 1901. The show toured Europe twice, and Annie became an instant favorite of crowned heads and common folks alike. In 1926, Annie became seriously ill. She and Frank moved back to Darke County, where Annie died. Her body was sent to Cincinnati to be cremated. Her ashes were sent back to Darke County in a loving cup given her by the people of France. 18 days later, Annie's husband of 50 years, Frank Butler, also died. On Thanksgiving Day, they were buried side by side in a small graveyard near where Annie Oakley first learned to shoot. In 1964, another well-publicized show came to town, one eagerly awaited by young people. August 28, 1964, marked the first of 2 Cincinnati appearances of the Beatles. They were greeted at the airport by screaming fans and curious reporters, then inside the terminal held their only news conference.
John, how do you explain the reaction of teenagers to your type of music?
I don't know, I have the same feelings about our type of music as they do. I'm not a teenager. I've just liked this kind of music for about 8 years, or since it came out. It's just good, good fun. Music. It's good fun music.
The performance later that night at Cincinnati Gardens was packed with shouting fans, while police patrolling the arena plugged their ears. Two years later, on August 20th, 1966, the Beatles put on their last show in Cincinnati at Crosley Field. The first movie theaters in Cincinnati were Nickelodeons. By 1954, Cincinnati was one of only 17 American cities with a theater equipped to show Cinerama, a projection format designed to put the audience in the middle of the action. But by 1960, the Capitol Theater was back to showing regular movies. The Cinerama fad was finished. By the 1970s, so were most of the downtown movie houses. Rising costs and falling attendance had taken their toll. One by one, they came down. An organization called Save the Albee fought a losing battle to have that theater incorporated into the planned Fountain Square South development. In 1977, the Albee fell victim to the Wreckers' Ball. But all was not lost. The Marble Arch, which had adorned the entrance, was saved, stored along the Ohio River for almost a decade until brought out and fit into the design of the expanded Albert B. Sabin Convention Center. Cincinnatians always have shown a great love for sports as well as art, movies, and music. Tennis clubs were the rage at the turn of the century, so were bicycle clubs, even though some people found riding small bikes tougher than mastering the ones with the big front wheels. Many Cincinnati athletes went on to national and international renown. Jockey Eddie Arcaro, who was born in Cincinnati and raised in Newport, won the Kentucky Derby 5 times, went on to the Triple Crown twice. Arcaro was one of the 3 original members of the Jockeys Hall of Fame. Bill Talbert was national singles champ and Davis Cup captain. Tony Trabert won Wimbledon in 1955.
The 6-foot, 24-year-old court king from Cincinnati puts on a crushing display of power reminiscent of Don Bud.
Ezzard Charles is the only Cincinnatian ever to become undisputed heavyweight boxing champion. He did so by beating Jersey Joe Walcott in 1950. But Charles actually is best remembered for a fight he lost to Rocky Marciano. When the savage bout was over, both men were battered, Marciano worse than Charles. Marciano had won and was never to lose in his career, but no one ever came closer to beating him than Ezzard Charles. Actor Sylvester Stallone said it was the Charles Marciano fight that inspired the film Rocky. The Cincinnati Reds have certainly contributed a number of memorable moments, including one of the greatest individual accomplishments in the history of baseball. On a warm September night in 1985, Peter Edward Rose stroked the 4,192nd hit of his career, surpassing Ty Cobb to become the most prolific hitter baseball has ever known. '69 was the year George Ellard and Sir Alfred Goshorn signed English cricket star Harry Wright, his brother George, and 8 other men to play baseball for pay as the Cincinnati Red Stockings. Baseball's first professional team traveled 12,000 miles from Boston to San Francisco, took on all comers, and won 64 games without a loss. The Reds signed baseball's first hearing-impaired player shortly before the turn of the century. He was outfielder William Hoy, a deaf-mute who actually preferred his nickname, Dummy. Because he couldn't hear, Dummy Hoy asked umpires to signal with their hands when runners were safe or out and whether pitches were balls or strikes. Those signals, instituted to help Dummy Hoy, are the ones still in use today. On May 2, 1917, the Reds clashed with the Chicago Cubs in a game that featured the greatest pitching duel of all time. After 9 innings, neither side had a hit. Right-hander Fred Toney pitched for Cincinnati. The big left-hander Hippo Vaughn hurled for Chicago. Their duel ended in the 10th, the Reds winning on an infield single by a little-used right fielder destined for the Hall of Fame, the Football Hall of Fame, Jim Thorpe. Yes, the same Olympic hero whose gold medals were stripped away because he had played semi-pro baseball when he was in college. In 1919, the Reds made the World Series for the first time since the postseason championship was instituted in 1903. Sadly, the 1919 series went down in history as the Black Sox scandal. The Chicago White Sox had won the American League title and were considered the superior team by far. Yet the Reds won. A year later, several Chicago players admitted they were offered money to throw the series. Ed Roush, a star outfielder on that 1919 Reds team, always contended that White Sox players did throw the first game, which the Reds won handily, but that they were never paid by the Chicago gamblers suspected of fixing the series. So, says Roush, the White Sox did their best to win the rest of the games, but the Reds beat them anyway. 19 years later, fireballing left-hander Johnny Vandermeer accomplished a baseball feat which hadn't been realized before and hasn't been equaled since. He pitched back-to-back no-hitters, first against Boston, then against the Brooklyn Dodgers in the first night game ever played at Old Ebbets Field. 1939 saw the Reds in the World Series again, but they were blown away by the New York Yankees in 4 games. A year later, they won the championship in a tightly played 7-game series against Detroit. The Yanks annihilated the Reds again in the 1961 series, this time in 5 games. In doing so, Whitey Ford broke Babe Ruth's most cherished record, 29 2/3 consecutive scoreless innings pitched in World Series competition. Cincinnati dominated baseball during the 1970s when the Big Red Machine won 6 division titles, 4 pennants, and 2 world championships. The most memorable achievement for the Cincinnati Bengals came on one of the coldest days in the city's history. A trip to Super Bowl 16 was at stake on that January Sunday in 1982. The wind chill factor dipped to nearly 60 below zero. Despite the numbing cold, the Bengals roared onto the field with their linemen in shirt sleeves. The San Diego Chargers, the Bengals' opponents that day, stared shivering in disbelief. The Bengals won the psychological battle before the kickoff and the game itself 3 hours later. Crowds celebrated on Fountain Square with a chant that had been the season's battle cry. San Francisco stopped the celebrating, beating the Bengals in the Super Bowl. But there was no doubt the Bengals had come a long way from the days of lopsided losses at UC's Nippert Stadium, where the team played its home games its first 2 years until the move to Riverfront Stadium in 1970. In 1987, Riverfront Coliseum hosted the best figure skaters on the planet at the World Championships. When the competition was over, the grace and charm of skaters like East Germany's Katharina Witt and America's Debbie Thomas were etched into the memories of area residents forever. The Coliseum also was home to the ill-fated Stingers, the last of several hockey teams that tried to convert Cincinnatians to the joys of face-offs, power plays, and hat tricks. The Stingers, like the Swords and Mohawks before them, eventually skated into oblivion. Another pro franchise, now just a memory, was the Cincinnati Royals of the National Basketball Association, who moved from Rochester in 1957. A few years later, the Royals featured a starting lineup of homegrown talent. Center Wayne Embry from Miami, forward Jack Twyman and guard Oscar Robertson from UC, forward Jerry Lucas from Ohio State by way of Middletown, and guard Arlen Bockhorn of Dayton. The team won more than 50 games one year and took the Boston Celtics to 7 games before losing in the NBA playoffs. By the 70s, new owners had traded away the team's stars, attendance declined, and the franchise moved to Kansas City. The Royals never won a title, but the University of Cincinnati Bearcats thrilled their basketball followers with back-to-back NCAA championships in 1961 and 1962. Both years, they upset Ohio State teams led by Jerry Lucas and John Havlicek. Xavier's greatest moment in basketball came in winning the National Invitational Tournament in 1958, when the NIT was the major college postseason basketball event. There you have it, a sampling of great, near great, and not so great moments in Cincinnati history. Happy 200, Cincinnati. We've earned it.